Episode 13, Chapter 12, Stardust. Chapter 12. STAR. Dust. If there was one thing in the world that terrified Luigi more than ghosts, it was the sight of a transit hub during holiday season. He had been the one to argue against this whole crazy plan to infiltrate the Star Festival, and yet here he was, stumbling out of a warp pipe and into a merry stampede. The view of it rushed up all at once, gravity twisting against itself to find the new downwards as the walls and floor switched places. The worst thing about pipe travel is getting your bearings at the exit, and Luigi had barely managed before the nearby guards were shooing him out into the crowd. A second later, the riptide of tourists was threatening to sweep him up and away into the city, so he pushed his way over to some iron railing in an effort to steady himself. Mario and the others would turn up soon, since they had been right behind him, but in the meantime, Luigi was at the mercy of the swarm.
I can't believe this. Has everybody in the world turned up for this sham of a party?
It certainly seemed that way, at least. Back home, the yearly Star Festival always brought lots of visitors to the capital, but it was never on a scale like this. People were springing from the floors, spilling from the walls, and generally warping in from every corner of the realm. Between the eager chatter of 1,000 different species, and the low, constant jayak of the pipes, it was getting hard for Luigi to hear himself think. This was Pipeline Central, a grand station beneath the streets of Mushroom City, and the main nexus of the kingdom's entire warp pipe network. In this land, even the smallest villages typically had a pipe or two, short warps to slightly larger nearby towns, which would have their own pipes to even bigger cities. Like capillaries into veins, it all eventually led back to this, the beating heart of public transportation. It was a beautiful bed of chaos, and a total labyrinth in every sense of the word. Balconies lined the sides of a soaring concourse, each a terminal for a bay of sleek green tubes. Elsewhere, blue brick tunnels snaked away towards deeper warp zones, offering travel to more distant regions. The main floor was an open expanse speckled with ticket stalls, information booths, and oh so many souvenir stands. Somewhere in here, Luigi had heard, there were fancy restaurants and even a shopping mall. Above it all loomed a single titanic display board, an iconic image for the travelers who passed this way. The thing was a torrent of raw information, constantly updating to show which pipes were in use, where they led, and the most efficient warp routes between major destinations. Alerts flashed by for places like Diamond City, Glitzville, Delfino Plaza, and Jazafraz Town. It was almost too much data to take in. PSA messages crawled along the bottom. Safety precautions like please enter the pipe feet first. And report piranha plant intrusions immediately. There were some stranger ones too, which Luigi couldn't quite parse. All guests must egress by 11:30 p.m., said the board, soon followed by Starlight gives us purpose. He was still pondering the message's meaning when someone's hand tapped him on the shoulder. He nearly bolted in panic, until he turned and realized that it was only Mario, who had finally emerged with their friends in tow. None of them were exactly welcome in the Empress territory, and they were relying on the night's chaos to get them into the city unseen. Lurking behind Mario was Vivian, who was keeping to the shade and furtively eyeing the passers-by. It was odd. Despite her shyness, Luigi had never known the siren to be particularly anxious around crowds. After all, she had come to Peach's gala by herself, and Mario said she had been a regular butterfly at the bazaars back in Rogueport.
I can't blame her for being cautious,
he pondered as she glared out from behind her shredded hair.
She's still shaken from that night in Twilight Town.
Yoshi was standing off to the side, and a certain familiar chill let Luigi know that Lady Bow was nearby as well. That was it for their group. The resistance members were in some kind of system, so pipe travel was off limits for them. They'd be coming in from Moonview Highway by truck, and they'd all rendezvous somewhere out in the city. Truth be told, Luigi was a bit envious of them for managing to bypass this place.
So, are you guys hyped for a night of safe and totally inconspicuous partying?
Yoshi remarked, prompting the five to huddle up if they wanted to discuss their real plans. In a place this packed, there was no telling who might be listening in.
I'm sure it'll be crazy out there, but remember why we're here.
Mario nodded, dropping his voice to barely a whisper.
Princess Peach is somewhere in this city, and we're not gonna leave without her. Let's not forget about Gad's invention,
Luigi reminded, talking about the stellar reactor they'd all been tasked with retrieving. A machine that could transmute fuel into star power was much too dangerous to be left in villainous hands.
We still have no idea why they even stole it, and that doesn't sit well with me.
Vivian nodded and flashed the others a bright smile.
I'll do my best out there. After tonight, there won't be anything left to worry about. The bad guys will all be gone, and life can finally get back to normal.
Even as she said it, Luigi noticed that the smile didn't quite reach her eyes. With that, the heroes broke their huddle and fell back in step with the tourists, preparing for their long shuffle towards the surface. The exit was at the far end of the concourse, a line of ramps and escalators which sloped up and far out of sight. The tunnel walls were painted a metallic green, giving visitors the impression of one last pipe before they emerged into the city above. Luigi kept his eye on the crowd as he inched along, still astonished by the number of people to answer the Empress invitation. A nearby family of bob-ombs kept him from jostling too much, lest a collision set them all off. Elsewhere, slower creatures had piled atop wigglers as if they were shuttles, and Goombas had formed stacks to give themselves a larger, less squishable presence. Squeaks scurried and hopped across people's heads, cutting line and showing off at the same time. There was a liveliness in the air that hadn't been felt in this world for 20 years. Eventually, the group made their way through to the final checkpoint, a loose line of guards standing before the escalators, sizing up the arrivals before waving them on into the tunnel. Luigi hurried to avert his eyes, partly from caution but mainly by instinct. In the end, he looked back up when a large and ominous shadow passed overhead. The light in this part of the hall was eclipsed by an enormous technological structure hanging from the ceiling. It was a sort of inverted bulb that jutted downwards from above, connected to the higher balconies by a single suspended catwalk. The thing was looped by a ring of windows, revealing the blinking lights of machinery housed within. This was the station's primary control room, from which all of Pipeline Central was managed. Activity could be monitored, lines could be rerouted, and the whole system could even be powered down in case of absolute emergency. Such a thing had never happened in the terminal's history, not even during the storied Nipper plant plague of '88. Mario and Luigi had been inside that room once, long ago, and back in their own timeline. They had been called in to inspect some issue, and it had been awkward to explain their lack of expertise. They had been plumbers for a time back on Earth, but the sewer systems there weren't usually equipped for magical transport. And then, suddenly, the shadow was gone, and Luigi looked down to see that they had passed the checkpoint. They had been let into the city, and now the celebration awaited them outside. One by one, the heroes stepped onto the escalator and let it sweep them away. Vivian opted for the ramp, because the toothy stairs didn't want to play nice with her shadowy tail. Somewhere up there, the grand finale of their adventure was waiting. There was a light at the end of this tunnel, and they were all being carried up to meet it. It had taken them hours to find a street corner quiet enough for this meeting, and Mario was becoming anxious for things to get underway. The whole group was gathered on the patio of a quaint downtown coffee shop, far away from the noise and frenzy happening in the main boulevards. Navigating that party had been an epic adventure all by itself. A trek through food courts and carnival tents, past flash mobs and karaoke competitions. Every plaza and park was its own themed world, with games to play and a soundtrack of the kingdom's hottest celebrity bands. Even here, the wild dance music could still be heard echoing between the buildings. Glass lanterns shaped like star bits were strung between the street lights and across every intersection, lighting up the night with a dreamlike aura of green, red, and gold. It had been blinding at first, but as Mario's eyes had adjusted, the sky beyond had begun to show through. The city was bright and lively, but it was quite a thin facade that kept the darkness hidden. But it was quieter here, if only a bit, so the Amanita resistance was using the peace to prepare itself. Rolf had pulled his truck up to the sidewalk, and now he and Luigi were in the process of unloading the few supplies the Thugin had managed to smuggle in. Meanwhile, Goombella was instructing Toad and Toadette on how to fly the surveillance drones they had brought from the base. Toadette seemed to be getting the hang of it, but Toad's copter lifted off and promptly smashed into a lantern, bursting the both of them in a shower of sparks.
"Good job, little dude,"
Goombella encouraged, not even bothering to turn around. Toadette's screen was displaying an awesome aerial view of a sell-out concert happening in a nearby park, and both of the girls were enraptured. Mario, for his part, was pacing back and forth in silence, eager to start making headway toward the palace. He could see it looming in the distance, an immense walled district in the center of the city which overshadowed everything else. Pale spires scraped the sky like frozen spears, searchlights shining up from their tips like beacons.
"Everything we need is beyond those walls, and somehow we have to get inside."
He turned away with a restless sigh, unable to keep looking at the structure without feeling taunted by it. Instead, he walked over to a dark corner across the patio, where he found Vivian sitting on a bench and sipping on a drink.
"What have you got there, Viv?"
he asked curiously, hoping to bring the girl out of her shell with casual conversation.
"It's a Splunkin' spice latte, you want a sip?"
she answered with a wink, scooting over to give Mario space to sit beside her. He politely obliged, but kept his distance all the same. Vivian had been acting colder to the others lately, but she was suddenly much flirtier towards him. She had even kissed him outright that night on Twilight Trail. It had been confusing, and the hero still wasn't sure how he felt about the change.
"Just one little taste, come on, it's creamy and warm,"
the siren offered again, and Mario shook his head a bit too hastily. There was something off about all this, he decided. Not the flirtiness. That was strange, but not entirely unpleasant, but rather the drink itself. Vivian had never been fond of coffee, he remembered that from their day at the markets together.
"You're not acting like yourself,"
he pressed gently, causing her to glance awkwardly away.
"You know you don't have to hide around me, right? We've always helped each other out of the darkness, you and I."
Vivian squinted warily and shrank back into the shadows, but before either of them could speak again, they were being beckoned back over to the group.
"I reckon we're nearly ready to roll out,"
Rolf was saying as he leaned against a table and waited for the others to gather around. Goombella and the Toads pulled up chairs, and Bao materialized in the air by the shade umbrella.
"Let's wait 5 minutes for the dinosaur, and then we can head for the palace."
The only one missing was Yoshi, who had wandered off to find something fruitier than coffee to snack on. He returned soon after the announcement, holding a plastic cup with a pianta on the side.
"Hey Mario, guess what? You remember that guy with the juice trolley from the Star Festival back home?"
he asked eagerly, showing off his beverage.
"In this world, he managed to get himself franchised."
Mario looked closer, recoiling as he was hit by the unmistakable smell of pineapple eggnog.
Mamma mia, this really is the darkest timeline.
Now that everyone was here, there was little else standing in the way of the team and their goals. Only a citadel filled with guards, and its impenetrable outer wall. That, plus a certain hooded wizard that they might possibly end up battling, but that was an encounter they were all hoping to avoid.
So, is everyone clear on their roles?
The Dugin asked, prompting everyone to stay focused.
All 9 of us have to be on point, or else this plan is gonna fall apart faster than a pummeled pokey. Luigi and I will go on ahead and sneak into the palace,
Mario confirmed, earning a nod from his brother. They were more agile than the others, and could travel quickly by alleyways and rooftops.
Once we're inside, we'll find a way to open the gates for the rest of you. And I need to be with you,
Vivian added with a peculiar giddiness,
in case you need my shadow powers to sneak underneath the big wall. It'll be easy peasy, I promise I'll get you guys inside, right where you need to be.
Toadette chipped in next, eager to please.
When we all get there, Toad and I will use the drones to locate Princess Peach and the STAR thingy.
She kept going, showing that she had memorized everyone else's roles as well.
Then Goombella and Mr. Rofe will find a way to disassemble the machine, and Mr. Yoshi will be their backup, in case any enemies try to make trouble. And I suppose I'm just lucky to be here,
Bao huffed, floating a little bit higher. She was the only one without a defined part to play, and she had been snarking about that since back in Rogueport. It wasn't easy for her, not being the center of attention. Mario was still thinking about what Vivian had said a moment earlier. She seemed almost excited for the chance to use her powers, but hadn't she been scared of the shadows since they had arrived in this world? There was something afoot here that went beyond any kind of trauma. He decided to try an experiment, a little test of character that he had made up on the spot. He ushered the siren over to one side and leaned in as if to speak with her privately.
Do you still have those Power Rush badges we got at the Pianta parlor? They'll come in handy if we get into a tight situation with the guards. Oh yeah, totally,
she replied, giving him a smile and a mirthless giggle.
Those soldiers will think twice about hitting us, once we hit back twice as hard.
Mario kept his expression calm, but inside his heart was sinking with dread. Everything about this was completely wrong. They had gotten pretty lucky badges together, and they had been bought from Ms. Mo's shop with the last of their coins. Vivian knew both of those things, which meant that this wasn't Vivian, at least not as he knew her. His head was swimming with possibilities, each less pleasant than the last.
Did the Twilighters brainwash her somehow? Is she being possessed? Is this some kind of dupli ghost? Or something else entirely?
He didn't have much time to think, because suddenly Luigi was calling to him. The planning phase was over, and it was time for the mission to begin. Mario adjusted his hat and hurried to catch up, resolving to keep a close eye on Vivian until he had figured this out. For now, though, he would follow the path that had been set for him. With a last shared glance back at their friends, the brothers and the siren raced off into the night. Princess Peach sighed in indignant boredom as she watched the lights from her tower window. Whatever was happening out there in the city, it looked to be the spectacle of the century. The Empress had explained all about her plans for a Star Festival revival, that night atop the main spire, but to be honest, Peach hadn't believed a word of it. Surely nobody would come to such an event in a world without stars, right? Well, evidently she had been wrong, because the distant horizon was a jumping mosaic of colors and light. It was an enchanting sight, but the princess was more concerned with what was happening up on the palace walls. For days on end, builders and technicians had been swarming those marble cliffs like ants, hauling up bits of machinery and linking them into some great silver array of floodlights and solar panel cells. It was a monstrous, meandering sort of thing, and Peach wondered if it looped the entire citadel. Even now, at the height of the supposed festival, there were worker specks up amongst the machinery, adjusting the angles and testing the systems. Warning lights flashed in periodic bursts, and a few times Peach heard the faraway wail of an alarm. She saw the specks scramble back and forth to fix the issues, and hoped the machines blew up in their faces. She shook her head and turned away, tired of watching the skyline like she did every night. Maybe she'd try to get some sleep, or perhaps plot another escape attempt. The guards had taken her pile of moldy dolls after the last incident, so there'd be no more using them for surprise ambushes. She had no sooner climbed in bed than a troop of armored spearmen burst into the room, once again not even bothering to knock. At this point, Peach could only sigh and throw her arms up as they surrounded her, forming a tight ring as they lifted her to her feet.
What is it this time? Does my counterpart want me to watch fireworks with her while she threatens me?
One soldier stepped forward and grabbed her wrist, answering in perfect monotone.
Not tonight, princess, you are going to the ritual site. Our kind empress is ready to leave this world, and so it's time at last for her rebirth.
Peach's blood suddenly ran ice cold, and she barely noticed as her captors dragged her out into the hallway. This was it. The night that it all ended for her, a promise finally fulfilled.
She's going to steal my body, and this is all the preparation I get? Not even a last meal, just a come on, let's go.
Something about that made it all seem even less fair. She had gone from hoping for rescue to attempting escape, she had faced her fears and her own twisted mirror self. She had even risked her life to send a message to her friends, but now it seemed like all her efforts meant nothing. In just a little while, she would merely be a vessel for another woman's soul. She had been possessed before, but this wasn't like possession. It was a one-way transference of spirit, and when the process was done, she would simply be gone. She snapped back to reality when her escort shoved her into the iron lift, pinning her against the bars as the cage began to shudder painfully down the tower. In the distance, she had a perfect view of the mothership spire, glowing violet red and thrumming with restored power. She gasped aloud when she saw what state the thing was in. The Empress servants had been piecing the ruined ship back together, bit by bit, for as long as Peach had been a prisoner here. Looking at it now, it seemed almost entirely whole again. A skyscraper that could become a dreadnought with but a simple ignition. Suddenly, the princess had an image of it shattering the sky with a deafening mechanical roar. The mangled, half-melted tower had transformed into something out of a true nightmare. Way up at the very tip, still as gnarled as it had always been, the glass sphere pulsed with a golden glow. Peach recalled the spinning starburst behind the glass. The
instrument of celebration,
as her counterpart had called it. With her eyes, she traced the blue wires down from their nest beneath the machine, across the plazas and down the streets for miles, until finally they joined with the silver snake atop the outer wall.
It's going to be a magnificent ship, after the refueling is finished,
a soldier said from over Peach's shoulder, answering all of her unspoken questions.
I'd love to see the look on your face when we take it through to your world. It's a pity you'll be gone by then, huh?
And there it was. The plan, all laid out and easy to grasp. Once the massive ship had been given fuel, it would be an instrument of invasion once again. The people of her timeline would be utterly defenseless if this thing appeared in their sky. This was a relic from a war that had never even been fought over there. It would be the end of the world in a single night. Peach let out an involuntary sob as the tower sank from view behind the nearby buildings. She didn't want to see it anymore, but she felt as if she shouldn't look away. It was a monument to the victory of a truly tortured woman, who had finally managed to win in spite of it all. Unless...
Mario, wherever you are,
the princess whispered to herself as the lift touched down at last,
if you still care about me at all, please come quickly.
Somewhere outside the city, an uninvited guest was measuring the skyline with a crimson stare. A nervous army lurked among the rocks below, waiting for his signal.
Just look at that view, Cammy,
the Koopa King said, indicating the whole metropolis with a sweeping wave of his arm.
Those chumps are having the time of their lives in there. They have no idea what's about to happen, the total destruction we're gonna bring.
The old witch nodded as she floated beside him, looking almost as eager as he currently felt.
It will certainly be a night for the history books, my lord. They'll be singing songs of your bravery for generations to come.
She cast a glance back down toward the riverside, where everyone else was hidden.
You've certainly done a lot for the Koopas of this timeline. Yeah, I have, haven't I?
Bowser answered with a swell of pride.
When we take the palace, they'll have the keys to this whole dang world. A Koopa Empire sounds pretty awesome, don't you think?
His grin fell a bit when he thought about the implications.
I'll almost hate to bail on this place once we get Princess Peach back, but it has to be done. I mean, if I'm gonna rule a world, it's gotta be a fresh one, not this one that's all ugly and trashed. I suppose that is the way of things,
Cammy said with a sage nod.
In the meantime, we should probably go prepare the troops for battle.
Bowser grumbled in agreement. After all, they had a lot of work to do tonight. The ragtag little army was stationed down beside the bay, huddled in the shadow of the Great Mushroom Bridge. The steel structure hung low overhead, shielding them from watchful eyes within the city. It wasn't the most dignified place to be preparing for battle, but Bowser understood his minions' concerns. They were shellbacks in enemy territory, and hiding under things came to them by instinct. In spite of that, the king was pleased with how far his new recruits had come in the past few weeks. When they had set out from the Koopa Kingdom, they had barely known how to march or throw hammers, but once they had gotten down to business with a few high-intensity training montages, they had shown a truly surprising level of skill. He wasn't about to let them off easy, though. The stakes were far too high for that tonight. Princess Peach was stuck somewhere inside that city with her crazy evil devil. If Bowser couldn't reach them and set everything right, then this had all been for nothing.
This is my night, you hear? There's no way I'm letting those plumbers steal the glory this time.
Trudging down the hillside, he made his way beneath the bridge to give the big announcement. His troops were milling about in the shadows, having quiet conversations or painting war emblems onto their shells with river mud. Some Lakitus were busy fluffing their clouds into shape, while a group of shy guys practiced acrobatic drills in the background. All in all, it looked less like a gathering of warriors, and more like really dingy carnival troupe. But there was no confusion or delay when their leader appeared. Everyone snapped to attention and scurried into perfect formation. In moments, the rabble faded out and the air hung thick with anticipation. Some of them had been waiting for this night their entire lives, after all.
So, we made it to the party,
the king began, stomping to the edge of a nearby boulder and scanning the faces in the crowd. He saw uncertainty in a few of their eyes, but many just looked excited for the fun to begin.
They say everyone in the kingdom got invited to this shindig, but I haven't seen my invitation. Who knows, maybe I missed it, but what about you guys? Raise your hand if the Empress said she wanted you here.
Nobody moved to raise their hands, and there was a soft chorus of bitterness at the mere mention of Empress Toadstool. Bowser had made hundreds of these rallying speeches in his time, so he knew his cue to keep going.
If we're not supposed to be here, then that makes us gate crashers. Honestly, that sounds way more fun to me anyway. So how about it, troops, who's ready to smash down some gates?
There were a few open cheers at this point, and Bowser saw his elite Koopa trolls watching the newbies with keen interest.
Some of you are old pros at this gala-wrecking thing, but not everybody was here for the classics. If this is your first Star Festival, then let me tell you how this is gonna work. It's your very last tutorial, so listen up.
He turned to Cammy, who drew her wand and muttered some magic under her breath. After a few seconds, a ghostly projection of Princess Peach appeared within the river fog.
This lady here is more important than all of you schmucks combined. If you see her, bring her to me at all costs.
The misty vision swelled out, bloating into a cartoonish caricature of itself.
But if you see this thing, don't hesitate to attack.
A few jeers went up as the Koopas recognized the face of their enemy, and a couple of shy guys had started throwing rocks into the mist. As much as Bowser wanted to encourage their rage, he still had one more vital lesson to teach. He turned to prompt Cammy, but she was busy making her smoke puppet Empress dance for the crowd. He gave her an expectant growl, so she rolled her eyes and hurried to switch the image. The fog swirled into a pair of shoddy stick figures wearing red and green hats, and Bowser decided that it was a perfect representation.
If you happen to see a couple of mustached goofuses hopping around, you have to report it immediately. They're always nearby, with nothing better to do than get in my way.
He didn't want to overload his followers with backstory, so he let the presentation end there. The shapes in the mist swirled away, and the riverside returned to stillness for a few more moments. There was a restlessness growing in the heart of every Koopa, and everyone knew that the time for talk was nearly over.
Nobody in there is expecting us, but that won't keep them from fighting back.
Bowser pointed to the little supply area where he had kept the chest of power stars.
We've got a few minutes of invincibility stashed in there, but we're saving that until the very end. Until we hit the palace gates, we're on our own, understood?
There were a few anxious nods, and that was good enough.
Gra ha ha ha. I guess that's it, then.
The king laughed, taking a step backwards and out into the starless night. His loyal minions marched after him as one, the rhythmic beat of their footsteps echoing out across the water. Koopa trolls donned their helmets as Magic Koopas mounted their brooms. Bowser heaved the star chest up over his shoulder and turned to face the city, obscuring the skyline with a rousing blast of flame.
I know you've all been dying to hear me say these words,
he shouted back into the wind,
so here it goes. Koopa troop, attack! It's pretty weird, isn't it?
Luigi whispered from a spot in the bushes somewhere nearby.
So many people are dancing out there, but it feels like nobody is moving.
Mario gave his brother a questioning glance, but Luigi just shook his head.
It's like the whole city is holding its breath, except nobody actually is.
Mario realized that he knew the feeling, even if he had never really thought about it before. There was a calm before every storm, and seasoned adventurers could sense that stillness in their souls.
Big things are about to happen, Luigi, but we'll pull through just like we always do.
The heroes had made their way further into the city, and were now at the outskirts of a field called Inoki Park. It was hosting several festival events this evening, from a wild rave at the far end, to a modest bake sale nearby. There were guards patrolling the area, so Mario and the others had ducked into the bushes to keep hidden. It was much easier to see the palace from here, with fewer skyscrapers standing in their way. The white towers rose high behind their curtain wall, stabbing at the sky for miles in either direction. There were unseen lights shining on the spires from below, giving them the appearance of shimmering crystal glass. During the approach, Mario had noticed one tower that stood high above the others, and which seemed to be glowing twice as bright. Light poured from the tip like a radiant starburst, a single golden supernova against the void. He had pointed it out to Luigi and Vivian, and they'd all generally agreed to make it their destination. If the princess and her counterpart were inside the citadel, they'd be up there for sure. Mario shifted his gaze toward Vivian, observing her as subtly as he could. Right now, she was staring at the faraway beacon with no hint of emotion, whispering almost inaudibly to herself.
Still don't understand why it needs to be right there. It's too bright like this. Much too bright.
Sooner or later, he was going to have to confront her about all this, and he wasn't looking forward to that time. If the siren was being possessed or controlled, he would find some way to break the spell. If this was an imposter, if the real Vivian had been hurt in any way, well, he didn't even want to think about that painful possibility. But that was an issue for later, when this mission was behind them. For now, all he could do was watch her closely, protect Luigi, and be on his guard. She seemed to be on their side for the time being, but there was no telling when that might change. Suddenly, the soldiers were moving off across the field, going to break up a scuffle that had broken out between some boomboxers in the mosh pit. Luigi tapped him on the shoulder, but Mario was already pushing himself to his feet. He had seen the signs for himself, the way was clear, and this was their signal to get moving. The two brothers set off on the stealthiest path across the field, with Vivian trailing lazily after them. They passed the bake sale and a pizza dinosaur concession stand, and then snuck around the back of a sea blue tent marked Gigi and Mary's Festival Rest area. They traveled quickly, and soon they were on the far side of the park, alone except for some Toad and Goomba kids playing in a splash pad fountain. And a single gray iron soldier, standing at the sidewalk and keeping an eye on the scene. Luigi took a step too far into the plaza, wandering straight into the figure's flickering field of vision. Mario could only grimace and pull Luigi back as the guard lifted his spear and began to approach.
"Hey, you there!"
the soldier called out, his voice laced with suspicion as his weapon gleamed in the lantern light.
"Let me get a good look at you. I swear you're pretty familiar, guy. In fact, you look just like one of the fugitives on the wizard's list."
Tendrils of gossamer shadow were snaking up like weeds through cracks in the concrete, their ends fanning out into reaching, grasping hands.
"Wait, what's the meaning of THI?"
he began, but the phantom arms cut him off as they shot out to wrap around his waist and shoulders. Instantly, he was plunged beneath the shadows and forgotten, and the hands retreated as quickly and silently as they had come. Mario and Luigi could only look to each other in bafflement, and things only got spookier when they noticed Vivian sneaking up behind them with a mischievous grin.
"Wow, you guys almost screwed everything up. I guess you're lucky that I'm always here to help."
Luigi was sputtering in shock, looking back and forth between the girl and the pavement where their enemy had vanished.
"Hold on, so you can pull people into the shadows from a distance?"
Mario kept silent, but he was just as eager to hear her answer. It wasn't the explanation he had been hoping for, though.
Of course I can. I've always been able to do that, silly."
Mario must have looked a bit too skeptical, because Vivian's grin fell when their eyes met.
"Or have I not? Maybe it's a new power, and I just leveled up without anyone noticing."
It was a flimsy excuse, and she knew that he knew it. But before things could escalate any further, they were all pulled back to awareness by the sounds of screaming children. Mario looked up at the splash fountain, only to see the kids scattering every which way, back into the park or off down the street. At first, he assumed they had been scared by Vivian's shadow hand attack, but that didn't explain why the rave music had stopped in the background, or why everything was starting to shake. There was shouting in the distance, and the sounds of breaking glass and car alarms. Poor Luigi was starting to look positively stricken by it all.
"Uh-oh, Mario," he whimpered as the yelling got ever closer. "There's a flash mob coming, I can feel it in my bones."
He was right, but at the same time he was terribly wrong. Silence fell for one last, desperate moment, and then all hell broke loose. A few blocks away, a rioting crowd exploded from around a corner, chanting war cries and smashing windows as they surged up the street like a tsunami.
"Oh stars, we don't need this. What in the world is happening over there?"
Mario asked himself as the tide of mayhem kept right on coming. Somewhere in the city, the festivities must have finally broken down.
"They're headed straight for the palace,"
he realized with sudden horror. He couldn't exactly blame these people for wanting to revolt, but the last thing the heroes needed was more activity at the palace gates. It wasn't until the first Lakitu whizzed by that Mario realized something far stranger was happening. The gust of wind nearly blew his hat off, so he leapt back to watch the mob from a safer vantage. He couldn't quite believe his eyes. It was a familiar sight, but something he had never expected to see while he was here in this world. They were Koopas. Hundreds, maybe even thousands of them, swarming through the city with plain fury in their eyes. The ground was a violent sea of shells in every color, and magic Koopas blitzed the buildings with spell blasts from above. There were shy guys, too. Hordes of the little mischief makers were scurrying around between the troops, flinging trash and generally roughing up any spot that the others had missed. Even as the first group continued to approach, a second wave burst into view in the distance, traveling down a parallel street. Partygoers were fleeing ahead of them in droves, and once or twice, Mario thought he saw the telltale orange glow of fireballs reflected against the skyscraper glass.
"No, this isn't just a riot. This is a bona fide invasion. Why is this happening?"
Luigi asked in an urgent whisper, taking another step back as the mob reached the plaza and began to fan out.
"The history books I read said that the last Koopas fled up into the mountains, never to be seen again. I guess they were just biding their time,"
Mario answered with an equally urgent shrug. These uninvited guests were about to put their whole plan in peril.
"Listen, we have to get to the citadel before these guys do. Get set, Luigi, because it's time for a speed run."
The younger brother gave a nod of understanding, kneeling down in preparation for the sprint of a lifetime. Sadly, this newest idea was doomed to failure before it had ever even begun. A trio of flying paratroopers swept down from nowhere, claws outstretched and ready to snatch them up and away. Mario felt himself plunging into Vivian's shadowy abyss, and looked up to see one of the paratroopers do a truly epic face plant into the pavement where he had been. Luigi was far less lucky. He could only kick and scream as the other two winged creatures grabbed his arms and effortlessly lifted him into the sky.
"Mario, where did you go? Help me, bro."
Mario was helpless to watch as his little brother vanished between the skyscrapers. He wanted so badly to swim for the surface, and to escape the sudden chill, but he was utterly powerless in this realm. The world passed him by as he floated behind a fog, and Luigi's panicked shouts became steadily quieter, until finally they were gone. The shadows spat him out a few seconds later, back in the bushes and away from the chaos. Being down there this time had felt nothing like Vivian's usual gentle embrace, but he didn't really have time to think about that right now. The Koopa tsunami was gaining valuable ground, and now Luigi was being abducted, to boot.
"Gee, that sure was a close one,"
the siren remarked as she emerged from below, not even trying to sound sincere anymore.
"I guess it's down to just the two of us now, isn't it? You know, they always say that three's a crowd."
Mario just ignored her, having no patience for this imposter's weird games anymore. If his Vivian were here, she'd be supportive and understanding, and would help him to think up a new plan.
The Vivian
that he was stuck with only seemed good for making snarky quips and veiled threats that were way more transparent than she thought. This was a very bad situation, and there weren't many options. He could never hope to keep pace with the airborne reptiles on foot, and he didn't have time to get up to the rooftops in order to chase them from there. He had no power-ups to use, and the Lackey 2s with their clouds had long since flown off. All he had was a steady stream of ordinary Koopas, and they couldn't provide him with anything except...
Mamma mia, that's it. I do have a way to pick up speed.
Wasting no time, Mario vaulted into the air, and then landed hard on the nearest Koopa Troopa to pass underfoot. The startled soldier gave a yelp and retreated into his shell, falling dormant to the curb as the rest of his comrades trundled right on by. Mario reached back to pick up the shell, sweeping it into his arms as he set off across the plaza at a breakneck sprint. He veered this way and that, dodging the outlying enemies as he made his way toward the heart of the swarm. The splash pad was straight ahead and coming up fast, so the hero adjusted his speed accordingly. He had to time this maneuver perfectly, or he'd end up stranded and soaked. In one fluid motion, he tossed the shell down and leapt aboard, just as the central geyser burst into life. In an instant, man and turtle were launched skyward by the pressurized jet, their momentum carrying them up and over the crowd toward the empty streets beyond. One or two Koopas looked up and pointed at the stylish display, and when the shell landed, it took off careening down the avenue like a rocket. Mario had never quite grasped why Koopa shells were so slippery, but when they were kicked or thrown, those babies could slide for miles. Long ago, he knew how to surf atop them like a pro, but he had sort of lost that skill over time, mainly from disuse.
Hopefully, it's one of those things you never truly forget, like how to drive a go-kart.
He heard Vivian screaming after him, racing to catch up in a sudden frantic fury.
Wait, where are you going? You can't just leave me here by myself.
The imposter was still playing to his sentimentality, but her attempts were getting feebler by the word.
Get back here. I made a promise to get you safely inside the palace. Isn't that important to you? I said get back here.
There were shadowy hands erupting from the pavement, trying to snare the shell and trip Mario to the curb. But he was moving too fast, and she wasn't leading her shots. Before long, he had pulled far ahead and left her behind. With any luck, it meant he'd have time to focus on finding Luigi. The city lights were whooshing past in a dreamy rainbow blur, and Mario tried his best to keep up speed as he leaned left and right to veer around obstacles in the road. He slipped up a couple of times, and as the shell ricocheted like a pinball, he felt truly sorry for the little creature trapped inside. Grey soldiers were spilling into view by this point, rushing from their posts in response to the Koopa threat. Mario couldn't see the invaders themselves, but he could definitely hear them all around, still making chaos in the parallel streets. He finally caught a glimpse of the horde as he passed an intersection, surging in the direction of the palace gates. He crouched down in an effort to speed himself up, even if only just a little bit more. He still hadn't seen Luigi, and the end of the line was getting scarily close. If he wanted to have any chance of success, he'd need to head the army off at the pass. A spearman was standing in the way, so Mario hooked an arm around his weapon and used it to swing into a sharp turn. If he kept going down this new street, he'd meet them just before the end. The gates were looming directly overhead by now, the foreboding entrance to the Empress-walled inner city. Banners hung from the mighty marble slabs, deep violet and displaying that awful mushroom sigil that looked too much like a skull. Over the walls and beyond, the spire's searchlights were panning down to cast their wary gaze out into the coming madness. Too soon, the last few civilian buildings were peeling into the background, and there was nothing left between Mario and the palace except a grand moat and the Koopa swarm itself. Enemies from all factions were pouring into the scene from every side, filling the courtyard and piling the excess onto a great stone bridge that spanned the lake, the last straightaway before the citadel. A call for help echoed down across the water, and the shell rider snapped to attention immediately. The paratroopers were descending from out of the night, carrying Luigi on an intercept course toward the army on the bridge. The space between the brothers was choked with foes, but all Mario had to do was leap the guardrail, and he could surf out across the moat and bypass them all. That's when he spied the hulking figure out on the expanse, leading the charge with great lumbering steps. The bony spikes of a monstrous green shell flashed in the light of 100 fresh fires.
It can't be. The version of him from this world died years ago, right?
But there was no mistaking the shape of that shell, the heat of that flame, or the sound of those furious roars. Somehow, Bowser himself was here with them, worlds away in the heart of enemy territory. He had to know why, but before he could ask, a sudden impact threw him head over heels into confusion. Mario had taken his eyes off the path, and so he had plowed straight into the fence he had meant to leap. The shell bounced backwards, tearing off through the crowd and scattering those in its way. On the other hand, its rider tumbled over the railing and fell like a stone into the lake. But it wasn't water that he splashed down into at the end of his fall. Mario opened his eyes to find himself swimming in shadow, and realized that a certain someone must be snatched him in midair. He could feel the siren's tendrils around his ankles, and could hear her cold laughter echoing in all around him.
"Who are you?"
he yelled out into the abyss, finding courage in the sudden stillness that fell when he said those words.
"I know you're not her. I've known it for a long time, because the real Vivian would never act the way you have."
It was true, so how had he ever been fooled by this creature who was so unlike her? Vivian was kind, compassionate, and trusting, and he had failed her in every way. The silence turned to screams before he had even finished speaking, and suddenly the false siren was there, grappling with him in the darkness. Her eyes had taken on a kind of wildness, sharply focused and filled with malice. She was scratching and tearing at him all over, even as the shadows pulled back and they shot up toward the surface together. When they burst through the pavement and back into reality, it took Mario a minute to realize where they had ended up. His back was to the palace gate, but the moat was gone, and so were the Koopas and his brother. Before him was a stark and alien landscape of white towers and blue wires. He was beyond the wall, and he wasn't alone. Mario stood up on shaky legs, turning to regard his new audience with the last of his determination. He had emerged into a ring of grey soldiers, all standing as quiet and still as iron candles in the gloom. Slowly, their spears lowered into the circle as one, sending Mario a very clear message: this was a battle that he could never win.
"They were expecting me to be here,"
the hero came to realize, noticing how none of them had been surprised to see him arrive.
"They were waiting for me in this very spot. It was that imposter's plan all along."
He had been on guard, but she had trapped him in the end, all the same. Now, she was standing there across the circle, holding one arm while she glared daggers at him from behind her matted bangs. She was breathing rapidly and shallowly, and from far away it almost looked like she was crying. Neither of them spoke for a very long time.
I am the real Vivian,"
she finally spat, referring to what he had said back down in the void.
"Don't you dare compare me to that timid little thing that followed you here."
She closed her eyes and balled her shaking hands into fists.
"She makes me so sick, always humming and stuttering, and pining for you when your back is turned."
She broke into a sneer, and began to mockingly twiddle her fingers together.
"She's like, oh, how I wish Mario would, please notice me, so we can, be together."
The impression soon broke down into a fit of fake giggling.
"Bleck, gag me with a spiny. Do you have any idea how hard it was to keep up that act? How did she ever fall for a tubby softy like you?"
Mario wasn't really sure what to say, or even what was being said at the moment. One part of the message was clear as a bell, though. This monster had done something to his friend, and now she had the gall to laugh about it.
"Where is she? Tell me what you've done to her, you."
Her answer was quiet, but dripping with venom.
"She's in some dirty pit somewhere, I guess. Who knows, maybe I'll stick you in the same one. It doesn't matter, since they'll never find either of you."
With that, the guards began to move in, closing the circle until Mario had no room left to move. The back rows kept their spears raised, just in case he tried to pull any high-jumping tricks. Before long, they had pinned him to the ground and bound his wrists with rope, so tightly that he could barely feel his hands. Mario was a master of escapes, but this time he was well and truly captured. The false Vivian leaned down to whisper one last taunt before the guards separated them.
"You know, you should really be grateful to me. I got you inside the palace, just like I promised."
She began to back away, snickering as the crowd swallowed her up.
"I wouldn't want to be caught outside the walls right now. Things are about to get real bad out there."
A second later, the world was lost behind a blindfold, and Mario was being dragged away to parts unknown. The last thing he saw was that shining ball atop the spire, pulsing, spinning, and glowing slowly brighter. It suddenly struck Luigi that there was one thing even worse than holiday traffic, falling from the sky into the path of Bowser Koopa. Adding insult to the injury, it wasn't even a very dignified entrance. These two paratroopers had taken him halfway across the city by force, and at the end of the ride, they didn't even give him the courtesy of an easy landing. Instead, they just turned him loose, and then pulled back up to continue on their way. It was a short fall, but it still managed to knock the wind out of him. Staggering to his feet as soon as he was able, Luigi got his first good look at the surroundings. He was at one end of a very wide and ornate bridge, carved from the same white marble as the gates towering behind him. Mushroom City stood bright and colorful across the water, an ironic backdrop for the horrors consuming the foreground. The bridge itself was choked by a solid mass of Koopas, and the plaza beyond was currently a battlefield. The Empress Guards had finally mustered themselves against the invaders, and now the two groups were fully engaged. Strangely, there didn't seem to be nearly as many grey soldiers as there should have been, this close to the palace.
"It's almost like they're only pretending to put up a fight, but why?"
Luigi heard voices nearby, and turned to see Bowser speaking with the two paratroopers from earlier, who seemed very excited and giddy with themselves. They were pointing his way, and as the king glanced over, Luigi realized that he was stuck in the open with nowhere to hide.
"How is that brute even here? He should be back home, where he can't cause us any trouble."
If Luigi had been expecting instant hostility, Bowser didn't give it to him. The large Koopa just gave a bemused grunt and raised an eyebrow.
"Well now, if it isn't Lamer Mario. What's up, did your brother get lost in a drain on the way here?" "He'll get here soon, I think,"
Luigi replied, trying and failing to sound confident. Truth be told, he had no idea what was taking his big bro so long. Earlier, he thought he had seen a flash of red zipping toward the lake, but he must be imagined it, because a second later it had gone.
Even if he doesn't turn up, I'll just take you on myself.
That at least earned a chuckle from the king, who took a step forward.
Yeah, I really doubt that. I mean, buddy, there's a reason why you're always player 2.
Losing interest, Bowser turned away and stomped back to the head of his army.
Whatever, I'm not here for you guys anyway. You can stay and watch, but this night is all about me.
He took a stance between his minions and the wall, inhaled deeply, and began bellowing out his ultimatum.
Listen up, goons of Anti-Peach. This can go one of 2 ways, you hear? Either you open up and surrender, or these gates are coming down.
There was no immediate answer, so Bowser roared and tried again.
Believe me, I can smash 'em up good. It'll be easy, once I haul out my secret weapons. Wait a second, he has secret weapons?
Luigi thought fretfully, wondering what could give Bowser the advantage, besides an airship fleet, which he surprisingly didn't have right now. A minute later, the witch Cammy shuffled out of the crowd, levitating an old wooden chest behind herself. She passed it to Bowser, who held it over his head in triumph.
So, there's something special in the box? Which way is this going to go?
It was about as tense as a situation could get. Flames were crackling in the distance, but otherwise the night air was totally silent. Nobody in either army wanted to move a muscle. They were all equally anxious to hear the Empire's next decision. The silence hung for just a moment too long, before being shattered at last by the grinding thum of shifting marble. Unbelievably, the colossal slabs were actually pulling back, splitting to reveal a sliver of the palace beyond. A wild victory cheer went up from the Koopas on the bridge, which stopped abruptly when the gates didn't open any wider. Now there were just hushed mutterings of confusion. Why was the gap so narrow? The answer came when 2 soldiers appeared, squeezing through the new opening in single file. They stood side by side before the assembled crowd, their flickering masks betraying no emotion but utter calmness.
Turn back, you're surrounded, and you have nothing to use against us,
one said as the other nodded matter-of-factly.
There is nothing in your chest but shameful failure, King Koopa.
Bowser's eyes flashed in eager defiance, and a wide grin broke out across his face. Clearly, he only saw the warning as a fresh challenge to his strength. Yet another thing for him smashed through on the way to victory. Soon he was laughing outright, shaking the box as he held it high.
Gway, ha ha ha! This is rich, you suckers just won't quit. I've got a level of power here that you can't even imagine. But don't take my word for it, let me show you, punks.
Time itself stood still, and everyone in the plaza waited with bated breath for whatever might come next. Cammy fired a blast upward, and blew the lid straight off the chest in a perfectly dramatic display. With a final grand guffaw, Bowser stepped back to clear the way, and then upended the box over the stone for all to see. To let the toys inside fall harmlessly out in a little jumble, squeaking softly as they bounced against the pavement. Soon, there was a pile of moldy and moth-eaten dolls laying in the yard, smiling sweetly out at the baffled crowd. It took Bowser a few seconds to catch up, but he did a full double take when he finally saw the truth.
Wait, what in the underwear is this supposed to be?
He muttered, stepping closer to dig around in the plus-highs with his claws.
No, they have to be in here somewhere. They can't just be gone, dang it.
Out on the bridge, somebody coughed. Cammy was inspecting the pile with a keener eye, and soon pulled out a scrap of stationery.
Hey, somebody left a note here. Shall I read it, my lord?
She exclaimed, and kept going when Bowser only sighed.
It says, thanks for bringing your friends, here are some of mine. I'm sorry that you weren't invited to the festivities, but you're welcome to stay for the finale. It's signed, your Empress.
Luigi was completely lost, but Bowser seemed to be putting the pieces together. He stared at the discarded box for a long time, his growling becoming more guttural as the truth finally dawned.
I've been sold out. Some minion must be snuck away with all the stars. But that's crazy, nobody has left my troop since I got here. Nobody except...
Embers flared from his nostrils, singeing the old cloth toys as they fell like rain.
Kamek. You sniveling clod, it was you all along.
The embers became an inferno as Bowser engulfed the poor dolls in blazing fury.
Get out here and explain yourself this instant, traitor.
The tension was so thick that it was nearly strangling. By now, some of the Koopas were losing faith, backing down from the bridge and slinking away into the darkness. In the end, a single smarmy voice answered the call.
Well, it looks like I've been found out. Excellent work, your gullibleness, I always knew you had it in you.
The little wizard had appeared as summoned, but on the wrong side of the enemy lines. He was perched atop a tall flagpole that stood to the left of the gate, his face partly shadowed by the hood of his robe. Everything clicked together for Luigi as soon as he saw the cloak.
You're the hooded figure. You've been the secret bad guy this whole time.
Kamek turned in mild surprise, as if he had only just noticed that Luigi was even there.
Well, I don't know about secret, but we've had a few encounters. I have to say, your group was much less fun to mess with than Bowser's was.
As he spoke, the mage rubbed his leg and winced in pain. Bowser was positively seething, pacing back and forth at the base of the flagpole.
So you've been messing with me, have you? You straight up stole the power stars.
The shout echoed back across the water as more Koopas left the scene.
Give 'em back, or have you forgotten who your king is? You're supposed to be loyal to me.
The wizard wasn't fazed. He merely tisked and shook his scaly head.
As if that matters. My loyalties aren't even a part of this equation. I'm only doing what's necessary to fix my last and greatest mistake. Your greatest mistake, huh?
Bowser scoffed from his spot beneath Kamek's perch.
You mean how you killed 6 kids and threw the planet into endless darkness, right?
The old Magic Koopa raised an eyebrow and gave a wry smile.
Yeah, I finally figured out the subtext in your little story, bub. I'm not that easily outsmarted.
Kamek shook his head once again, but this time he seemed to be enjoying himself.
No, that's not my mistake. I saved the world by sacrificing those kids, and I still say we're better off without the stars.
His smile faded, and his eyes became lost in the past.
I'm talking about something that happened later, after the storm had passed.
Luigi decided to interject at that point, to get some of his conclusions out in the open.
You're trying to fix something, and to do it you need Gad's Stardust reactor. It can't be activated without a pile of power stars, which you stole from Bowser over there. Am I getting this right?
The mage just waved him off impassively, not even meeting his eyes.
The reactor is the Empress' frivolous plan. I'm not a part of that beyond picking up the supplies. But that reminds me, I should probably be making my exit. I wouldn't want to get caught up in all the, excitement.
He rose into the air, and his face fully sank into the shadows of his hood.
I hope you all have fun out here. No, don't you warp out on me.
Bowser roared, but the wizard had already disappeared. At a loss, the mighty Koopa King was reduced to kicking at the flagpole in a tantrum.
Graah! I can't believe this. I had such a perfect plan this time, and now it's been ruined by that.
He cut himself off to squint around in bewilderment.
Hey, What sounds like machinery, and who turned all the lights on?
It was a slow process, but sure enough, the plaza was beginning to get brighter. It wasn't a harsh glow, and Luigi barely noticed until its warmth started to make his skin tingle. A few of the remaining Koopas were standing around uncertainly, scratching at their scales and pointing up at the heavens. Luigi followed their gaze, half expecting to see actual stars in the sky again. Instead, the light was emanating from a gargantuan snarl of technology sitting atop the palace wall, an endless array of floodlights, solar panels, and parabolic dishes that spanned the high horizon from end to end. The setup was strikingly familiar, and it only took Luigi a few seconds to remember where he had seen this kind of machinery before. These were the same devices that had littered the floor of Gad's secret hangar, the machines that gathered energy for the STAR.
Have you ever heard the phrase, "We are all stardust"?
The professor had said that night in the lab, sounding so proud of himself.
You see, I devised a way to convert physical matter into pure star power.
Luigi's eyes snapped down to the gap in the palace gates, and to the glowing sphere that was shining more brightly than any sun ever had. It was too late. The plaza, the bridge, and everything else ceased to exist. Koopas and grey soldiers alike were swept away by a screaming blast of starlight. Cammy was shrieking incantations at a fever pitch, coating Bowser and herself in as many shield spells as she could hold. No thoughts were spared for poor Luigi, who was shaking like a leaf as the stonework splintered and sublimated beneath his feet. For half an instant, he thought he felt the touch of a phantom hand against his shoulder. Then he was falling, and the entire world went white. Yoshi and the others were eating pizza in the park when they heard the explosion. It sounded like the void itself had awoken within the city. They had been trying to take it easy until the mission could resume. Rumor was that a riot had started near the gates, so they had decided to wait it out with a few slices of pizza dinosaur. It was the cheapest of festival food, but Yoshi thought it was better than expected.
The crust is kinda tough, and the sauce is a bit too thin, but it's not nearly as bad as the jingles say it is.
The plan had been to act casual, and then meet up with Mario's group when things had quieted back down. Rolf had insisted on taking precautions, and it hadn't been hard to convince Toad and Toadette to spend some time having fun. Yoshi and Goombella were less patient types, and the snacks they had shared were stress-eating at best. How long did it take to break up a few rabble-rousers, anyway? But all thoughts of progress evaporated in a heartbeat when the horizon collapsed into a wall of brilliant light. An astral curtain was rising in the distance, in the spot where the palace had been, a white wave that gushed out over the marble walls like a bursting dam, and then pulled itself skyward in a howling eruption of power and plasma. Reality itself seemed to warp and bend in its presence, giving way like melted wax as the starlight piled higher into the night. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing that Yoshi had ever seen. The light was pure and inviting, but so bright that it cast the surrounding city into silhouette. And then there were the noises, unnatural echoes and mechanical moans that defied all sense of reason. The wall sounded like the engine of a strangled jet, but the pitch kept getting higher and higher, and it never seemed to stop. Out in the park, people were either staring in silent awe or fleeing for their lives. The five friends watched the scene from the side of a little hill, unsure of where to go next, or what this new twist even meant.
I'll go ahead and ask,
Yoshi started when he sensed that no one else would.
Did the palace just explode?
Rolf lifted a paw to shield his eyes from the glare.
I've seen plenty of explosions in my time, and that back there is something entirely different.
He took a cautious step forward, as if testing the ground.
This hillside seems like a safe distance, though. I reckon we'll be fine here.
So that's precisely when the light began to spread, billowing outwards over the buildings like a blanket being pulled across grass. It was an utterly graceful, almost liquid sort of movement, and it seemed almost calming until the first skyscraper collapsed like sand. Everyone saw it, and so everyone panicked. Mushroom City spiraled into madness before the new stardust had even hit the ground. The music and laughter died as the Star Festival's grand finale began in earnest. Inns and arcades, carnival tents, and concert halls, they all started to empty as tourists boiled into the streets in terror. The starlight curtain followed, lapping at the heels of the people it was meant to consume.
Oh my gosh, I know what this is!
Goombella yelled frantically, going pale as she dashed a little further up the slope.
This light was in Gad's blueprints. This is how the reactor converts and harvests star power, and that means...
There was a pleading look in the Goomba girl's eyes, as if she were begging the others to run with her.
The Empress is harvesting her own city.
It was such an awful truth that Yoshi nearly staggered. Empress Toadstool had invited her subjects all the way here to burn them as fuel. Rolf had a much steadier head on his shoulders, because he immediately began barking orders to begin the escape.
Everyone, get in the truck. No, Toad, forget the pizza. We have to leave now.
The old Thugan was bolting for the sidewalk where he had parked the vehicle, with Goombella and Toadette hot on his trail. Toad was lagging behind, trying to gather a few last snacks, so Yoshi scooped him up and set off at a sprint.
Have you seen Lady Bow?
The dinosaur asked with a glance over his shoulder.
She was supposed to stay with the group, but...
The little fungus only offered a shrug at the mention of their ghost friend.
She hasn't been with me, because I haven't seen her in hours. I thought she was with you.
Yoshi squinted as that statement unraveled in his head.
That doesn't even make any sense. We've been in the same place the entire night.
Toad merely shrugged again and took another bite of his pizza. When they finally reached the street, it was a mad scramble to get into the truck bed before Rolf started the engines. Yoshi helped the others climb up while listening to those eldritch noises echoing behind the wall. Somehow, impossibly, the pitch still seemed to be rising, even after all this time. There was a name for this type of tone, but Yoshi was too busy shepherding his friends to recall what it was. He hopped aboard just as the engines revved into life, and then they were off, speeding down the road and snaking through the crowd. Pedestrians leapt out of the way to avoid them, as frightened of the battered old truck as they were of the advancing nightmare. The wall of light had engulfed more than a block in all directions as it rippled out from the palace in a colossal ring, and it was only speeding up. Mighty skyscrapers sagged and burst when the light drew near, scattering into showers of silver-blue dust. Instead of falling, the stardust was pulled upward against gravity, carried and swirled by the whims of an unfelt wind. All across the skyline, landmarks became tendrils of vapor that arced through the sky, over the wall and out of sight, as if drawn back home to some point of singularity.
So, what exactly did you mean by harvesting?
Toadette squeaked from her spot in the far corner of the bed. The little girl looked absolutely petrified, but genuinely seemed to want answers.
What's happening to all those buildings? What's happening to Mushroom City?
The truck made a sudden swerve around a family of Huffin' Puffins, and Goombella's ponytail whipped back to billow behind her as she tried to explain.
See, if I remember those blueprints right, then that light is a superheated magi-chemical reaction designed to, like, chew up matter and make star power. That energy feeds back into the machine to keep the reaction going, like an endless loop.
She paused, thinking over the acronym before saying it aloud.
The clue is in the name, the Stellar Transmutation and Amplification Reactor.
The two younger mushrooms looked at her like she had been speaking in Raven, so the Goomba gave an urgent simplification.
If you touch the light, you're gonna die.
As horrific as it sounded, the warning was true. After all, there must have been people inside all those buildings, and even now, the most distant screams were beginning to sound like something else. This evacuation couldn't save everyone, and those who had fallen behind were being transmuted, flaking away and losing themselves forever.
If we get stuck in traffic, that's it.
Yoshi thought as the truck turned a corner onto a wider road, taking out snack carts and souvenir stands as it went.
But what about Mario and Luigi, and Ms. Vivian?
Toadette asked, utterly distraught as she pieced together the possibilities.
They're still out there somewhere, even closer to the palace than we were. What if?
Yoshi put a gentle hand on her shoulder, to steady her, if nothing else.
They'll be fine, okay.
The dinosaur had known Mario long enough to have total faith in his skills, although perhaps not his judgment.
They'll help each other through this. Vivian has her shadow powers, and Mario can improvise a way out of anything. Luigi? Well, he'll be there too.
Toad gave everyone a bright smile, and an encouraging suggestion of his own.
Yeah, I'll bet they're inside the palace already. It's gotta be safe in there, right? The Empress would never harvest her own home. I'm not so sure about that, kid,
Rolf called back, leaning out the driver's side window to give his input.
After all, the lady doesn't seem to have a problem with sacrificing her own goons. Look at that intersection up ahead, they're making a blockade for us.
True enough, the street they were on soon widened into a square, where a line of grey guards had set up a defensive phalanx against the evacuees. They stood at all exits, blocking the paths to freedom with spears and riot shields. A few soldiers had even powered up with fire flowers, and were brandishing their flaming fists at anyone who tried to break the line.
Oh come on, that's just petty.
Goombella yelled as the truck skidded up the curb and hurtled into the intersection.
You're all gonna die too, you know. Brainwashing can only justify so much, you guys are just plain lunatics.
The soldiers said nothing. They stood amidst shattered lanterns and fallen banners, stoically watching their grim fate pulse forward across the city.
Hang on to something, kids,
the Thugin shouted back, slamming his paw decisively against the horn as the vehicle rocketed up to ramming speed.
We're about to go over one gnarly heck of a speed bump.
Later on, Yoshi would remember how satisfying it was to hear the guard's silent shtick break down right at the bitter end. As the blockade blew apart, Yoshi extended his tongue into the broken phalanx in hopes of slurping up some ammo. To his horror, he was the one who ended up snared. One soldier had the clarity and cunning to grab the sticky tongue like a rope, and as the truck sped by, the heroes pulled him free from the pile. Of course, the guard and the dinosaur were now stuck to each other, and it wasn't a very pleasant experience for either of them. Yoshi was hanging off the back of the bed, his tongue stretched to the point of snapping like a blooper's tentacle. Meanwhile, the soldier was being dragged along the pavement like a tin can on a string, his armor denting further with each bounce. He made one weak effort to reel himself in, hand over hand, but then Rolf turned sharply, and he was sent careening into the side of a parked tour bus.
Let th never speak of thith again,
Yoshi muttered as he pulled himself back together, still feeling a bit numb. He'd probably have to avoid solid food for a day or two, which was a bummer. At least Goombella and the others looked suitably impressed. The path ahead was clear, but time was obviously running out. The astral wall was still expanding, and the more it grew, the stronger its pull became. Trash and debris lifted off as if magnetized, spinning into the sky and breaking apart into wisps of stardust. The light itself had evolved into a violent energy storm. Static lightning scraped and clawed at the skyscrapers like bony fingers, eroding every surface that they touched. As scary as it all was, something about the spectacle was almost enchanting. Reality lost focus in the light's vicinity, becoming softer and less distinct. The distant screaming had faded to a kind of ever-present gurgling, and it was easy to forget that the gurglers had been people only minutes before.
"I don't get it,"
Toadette whispered as she lay back and watched the heavens swirl to pieces in a vortex of blue and white.
"I know the Empress is evil, but she's still Peach, right? How can she be capable of something like this?"
Toad pulled out his trusty phone as he sat down beside her.
"I don't know, but she just sent out another cheap."
Somewhere in the swirling mist, the sky lit up like a fireworks display as some grand stadium downtown evaporated.
"This one says, I have such a beautiful view of the festival lights. Thanks to everyone who is helping to make this night possible."
Rolf was leaning out the window again, informing the group of the latest developments.
"All right, so Moonview Highway is just up ahead. We're nearly out of this town, gang."
He grumbled to himself as he processed the unspoken question.
"Listen, I don't know what the range on that thing back there is, but it can't keep going forever, right? It'll stop following when it runs out of stuff to eat, yeah."
Yoshi wasn't so sure it worked like that, but he kept his mouth shut for the sake of morale. And for the sake of his aching tongue. At least they had a chance of outpacing the reaction once they got on the highway, and that was enough to inspire some hope in the dinosaur's heart. But then they rounded that last bend, and saw what had become of those who had tried their plan already. The city limits were in sight, but the boundary line was piled high with a scrabbling wall of partygoers. A tremendous horde of tourists and residents alike, climbing and thrashing overtop each other in a losing battle against thin air.
"No, they're not fighting the air,"
Yoshi realized with a spark of icy dread.
"That's a barrier spell, like the one around Peach's castle that night." "What are they doing out there?"
The Thugan muttered softly as the truck began to brake. Of course, he had never seen anything like this before, so it probably looked like hysteria to him.
"We don't have time to deal with it, whatever it is. I'm gonna drive us through."
The two toads screamed in panicked unison, having recognized the spell as well. They both knew how little good the impact would do. It would smear them all, and leave the barrier unhurt. Yoshi lunged across the bed to warn their driver before it was too late.
"Wait, that's a bad idea. I've seen a whole platoon of bob-ombs go off against magic like this and fail, so trust me, it won't work. We'll have to leave the city by another way."
Rolf gripped the steering wheel in pure agitation, hating the fact that they had basically stopped in their tracks.
"What other way is there, friend? What if all the other roads are blocked, too? Are we just gonna drive the Beltway until that starstorm guzzles us down?"
Luckily, Yoshi did have just one other idea. But it would mean throwing caution to the wind, which neither he nor the Thugan thought fondly of. Reckless heroism had always been Mario's page of the playbook.
"If we go right now, we can make it to Pipeline Central before it's gone. It'll be a race against the light, but it can be done."
Goombella was giving him a very skeptical look.
Did you forget something important? Rolf and I are in the criminal database. They'd never let us get anywhere near a warp pipe."
Any other time, it would have been a valid concern, but right now.
"Do you really think that matters?"
Yoshi shot back, needing to get his point across in as few wasted seconds as possible.
"In a little while, that database won't even exist anymore. It'll be erased along with everything else, and us too, unless we get to that station."
And so the engine roared, and the five of them were on the move again, speeding back the way they had come. Going against the light, it was easy to see just how quickly it was spreading and swallowing the path before them. Earlier, they had been trying to outrun the storm, but now they were playing chicken with it, trying to get as close as they could without letting it suck them in. There were still civilians running the opposite way, making doomed attempts to reach the city's edge, with no idea of what awaited them there. Yoshi saw a hefty blue Pianta struggle past with an armful of pineapples, and recognized the owner of his favorite juice bar.
"Yo, don't go that way!"
the dinosaur yelled out as the truck blew past.
"The exit is blocked, so we're gonna try Pipeline Central."
The Pianta skidded to a halt and turned around, spilling his fruit but following all the same. The electrical surges were becoming too intense for the city to handle, and the infrastructure was beginning to buckle in areas that the light hadn't even touched. The truck made a sharp turn onto Broad Shroom, and Yoshi saw the lights go sparking out for miles ahead of them. Marquee bulbs fizzed and popped, and street lights shattered as the heroes passed beneath, showering the pavement behind them in flurries of glass. For a little while, they were traveling parallel to the wall, and so they got to watch it eat the world in full panoramic glory. The auroral curtain still shimmered at the heart of it, but so much stardust was being pulled up and over that it had folded itself into a shimmering dome. The palace was somewhere in the heart of that bubble, safe and sound, but out here, there was no shelter but in death. They blasted into Pipe Plaza just as the light met the buildings at its edge. This place had been a beautiful courtyard just a few hours earlier that evening, a warm welcome for every visitor who had emerged into the city. Now it was a desolate slab of cement, as everything else from the trees to the corner shops had been uprooted and erased. In this open expanse, even the truck was struggling to gain purchase against the pull. But there it was, set into the far wall, the sleek green tunnel that would lead them below the streets, into the labyrinth of pipes, and far away to safety. Yoshi remembered climbing that passage with Mario and the others, and wondered how many lifetimes ago that had been. Nobody wanted to disembark up here, lest they be swept away without something heavy to grasp. Since the tunnel was wide enough, they were gonna ride it down in style. Rolf gunned the engines right to the entrance, to the edge of the widest ramp, and then just a little bit further than that. The vehicle pitched forward into the shadows with a groan, hung there for just one tormenting moment, and then plunged into the depths. It was immediately a bad idea, because there turned out to be people at the bottom of that ramp. None of them had expected Pipeline Central to still be occupied this late into the crisis, but lo and behold, the concourse was utterly packed. In fact, it looked like all-out pandemonium down there. The Thugan slammed on the brakes, but the slope was much too steep for that. He tried blowing the horn, but even though the people scurried back, there wasn't enough room to clear a path. It was an inevitable collision with a tragic guarantee.
"We're going to hit all those innocents. There's no way out of this one, unless... Everybody bail, right now,"
Rolf said, his voice sorrowful yet certain.
"There's one way to stop this old girl, but it's not gonna be pretty if we're here when it happens."
With a deep sigh, he threw open the driver's side door as Yoshi and the others vaulted from the back to tumble harshly down the ramp. At the last moment, he spun the wheel hard to the left and slammed on the gas one last time, sending the truck smashing through the railing of the nearby escalators. Rolf leapt free just in time, but his trusty old pickup had gone into the grinder. The truck slid sideways down the moving stairs, tearing through glass and metal as the handrails stabbed up into it like whirring harpoons. The steps themselves helped to slow the vehicle by grinding against the undercarriage, and soon the machines were mangling into a fusion as the rails bent and twisted through broken windows and crumpled doors. By the time the wreckage simply couldn't slide any further, it hardly looked like anything anymore. When Yoshi skidded to a stop of his own, he had to sit and stare at it for a moment. That battered old truck had carried them a long way, from Peach's Castle to Rogueport, to Forever Forest and back, and then all the way here, through the end of the world itself.
I hate to see it go like this, but at least its send-off saved a few lives.
Worried strangers were hurrying over to inspect the crash site, and to help the heroes get back on their feet. Yoshi stood up shakily, letting himself be supported by a trio of toad girls wearing full festival swag. Meanwhile, Goombella was further up the ramp, being fawned over by some blue Thugan in disco cosplay. She got away as quickly as she could, and soon the 5 heroes were being led over to join the herd. Somewhere up behind them, the first wisps of hungry starlight slithered into the tunnel's mouth. Inside the terminal proper, it was painfully easy to see what all the drama was about. A few thousand hopeful evacuees had fled into this place, only to be met with another blockade. The station guards had closed the security gates in some kind of bizarre last-stand maneuver, but the citizens had finally had enough. By the time Yoshi and the others arrived, the blue brick chamber had become a genuine battleground. Partygoers charged the barricades in haphazard waves, hoisting each other up and clambering over to the other side. It was like some morbid game of tag over there. Runners weaved between kiosks and ticket booths as they dodged pursuing soldiers and their spears. If they made it to the warp pipes, then they were home free. There were endless aisles and bays of them to pick from, and anyone would lead to somewhere safer than here. Boos and Paragoombas had a natural advantage, but most other attempts didn't even get close.
Yeah, let's maybe not go that way,
Goombella urged, indicating the presence of stairways to either side. They spiraled up to the balcony levels, which looked blessedly empty of enemies from where Yoshi stood.
I'm sure we can get to plenty of warp zones by running along the top, you guys.
As they climbed, the group had a perfect spectator view of the insanity happening below. Bit by bit, the mob was pushing its way deeper into the concourse, gaining ground as the staggered gates toppled one after another. The trickle of successful runners was becoming a stream as the guards lost swaths of their playing field.
I think they're gonna win,
Toad exclaimed in nervous excitement as another gate fell.
I think they're all going to get away.
Their little group had been spotted by now, and stragglers in the crowd were breaking away to follow their lead. In a moment of wild frenzy, enough floor space was finally cleared to let a group of bob-ombs do their thing. The last barriers were blasted away, and the flood was unleashed amidst a sea of cheers. To be honest, Yoshi felt like hooping and hollering right along with them.
I seriously don't believe it, but I think everybody in here is going to live.
Goombella raced ahead down the balcony, briefly examining each pipe entrance until she finally found one that satisfied her. A cobalt blue tube set into the wall opposite the entrance.
This leads to an airfield a few miles outside the city, the Goomba girl explained when the others caught up. It's not far, so we'll be able to keep an eye on things, and it won't be like we're just running away, yeah.
It seemed like the best available option, of the few that they had, so Yoshi wasted no time in beginning the escape. With the others hot on his heels, the dinosaur sprinted into the open tunnel, closed his eyes, took a very deep breath, and went literally nowhere at all. The warp wasn't there. Yoshi ran a bit further into the pipe, just to make sure that he hadn't done something wrong, but it was just a normal, empty metal tube, and it ended abruptly a few feet into the wall.
I think this one is busted,
Toad guessed as he and the rest glanced around in bewilderment.
Let's try the next one over, or...
But when they emerged, Yoshi soon realized why that idea wasn't going to work either. The overhead lights had suddenly shut off, submerging the massive chamber in near total darkness. The typical pipeline ambience was gone, replaced by a symphony of startled shouts and mayhem. It was a blackout. The only lights remaining came from inside the overhead control room, and from the gigantic display board that hung above the main entrance. The board is what drew everyone's eyes. if only because of the message that it bore. The text in the crawl read "Emergency Shutdown," but the person on the screen was telling a very different story. He was a toad guard, helmetless and wild-eyed, shouting fanatic threats from the safety of the upstairs office.
Nobody is going anywhere. The Empress fleet must be given fuel, and that means she needs every last one of you.
Back at ground level, the tunnel entrance was starting to glow steadily brighter, and before long, that mind-bending engine noise was shuddering through the walls. The wall of light unfurled into the station like an inverted sunrise, casting white rays along the walls as shadows stretched across the ceiling. The unlucky evacuees who had strayed too close were soon being sucked back into the tube, flushed upwards and screaming into oblivion. Everyone surely knew that only minutes remained, but Goombella was still freaking out about what that maniac guard had said.
Wait, since when does the Empress have a fleet?
The poor girl was waddling back and forth in some kind of existential denial.
How does she have a fleet? Why does she have a fleet?
Yoshi took a step back, a pitiful gesture against the sheer power of the light, and was caught by Rofe, who put a gentle paw on the dinosaur's shoulder. The Thugan spoke for everyone in the party to hear.
Bella, stay here and keep everyone safe, and get them into the pipes as soon as the power's back on. Yoshi, you're with me. We have to get upstairs.
Toadette looked horrified at the suggestion, and dashed over to stand between them and the staircase.
No, you can't go up there. That's where the bad guys are, and they'll get you both for sure.
She sounded so sincere that Yoshi was almost convinced. But he understood where Rofe was coming from. Somebody had to raid that control room and flip the switch, or else everyone in the station would be turned into ship fuel.
Hey, we'll be right back,
he assured her, putting a soothing hand on her pink mushroom cap.
Besides, I'll bet there are only like 3 guys up there, anyway.
Rofe was having his own moment with Goombella, the girl he had saved from the streets and given a purpose.
Well, we never did return that old truck to its owners like we promised. It's been a heck of a joyride we've had together, kid.
She smiled bravely as he mussed her hair and turned away.
Take care of the newbies until I get back, okay?
It was time. The Thugan hopped onto Yoshi's back, and the two of them left their friends behind, charging down the balcony in one last stupidly reckless act. The dinosaur dodged and ducked through the frightened masses, and he began jumping and fluttering above their heads when the traffic became too thick. He almost stumbled a few times in the darkness, but that became less of the problem as the room grew brighter by the second. The reactor's light was spreading into the concourse like a thing alive, clawing at the walls with lightning talons as its glow seeped forward across the floor like some kind of ghostly manta ray emerging from the sea. Yoshi wasn't very sure where that analogy had come from, but it made sense in his head. People were fleeing into the far corners of the hall, screaming ever louder as the storm's pull grew stronger. Lighter creatures were hanging onto railings and signposts for dear life, and those who lacked the strength to hold on, or the arms to hold with, were tumbling across the floor like dry leaves until the transmutation claimed them and they scattered apart. The spiral staircase was shaking, and Yoshi's head was spinning by the time he and Rofe finally made it to the highest floor. The catwalks were much thinner up here, and seemed to be meant only for employees and maintenance workers. They snaked all around, but only one led out to that black bulb of a control room. Sure enough, a pair of soldiers was standing along that exact path, spears raised and ready for anything. So Yoshi took a parallel bridge, leapt over the railing, and fluttered across to where he needed to be. He landed just behind the guards, and their surprised reaction gave Rofe enough time to grapple one and twist him over the edge. Yoshi swallowed the other point blank, and then threw the egg he made at a third and final guard, who had come rushing from the control room in a berserker rage.
Huh, What do you know? There were exactly 3 guys up here.
Yoshi noted as they entered the room to find it empty. It was a circular little space, lined with blinking panels and computer terminals, and there was a very obvious green power switch sitting just across from the doorway. This place was run by toads, after all. The systems weren't incredibly advanced. Rolf hopped off, and Yoshi went over to press the switch, holding it down until the base lit up and the sound of whirring motors filled the room. Screens and indicators danced awake on nearby panels, spreading out through the area in a glowing web with the button at its heart. Finally, a rumbling blast shook the ceiling as unseen generators kicked in, signifying the return of power at last. Looking out the windows, Yoshi could see that the overhead lights had come back on, although by this point, the lobby was so bright that it hardly even mattered. It was hard to hear anything over the grinding groans of the starlight eating its way down the hall, but soon the faint screaming turned to cheers and the telltale sounds of pipe travel. The dinosaur breathed a sigh of relief. The people were free at last, and not a second too soon. But there was a rude surprise waiting for them back out on the catwalks. The 2 heroes were preparing for their return journey when Rolf noticed 5 more guards clambering up the spiral stairs.
They're coming to see why their little scheme failed, and they won't be alone,
he warned as Yoshi looked down and saw that he was right. More soldiers were visible on the lower levels, traveling to the staircase in steady waves.
This is getting ridiculous. We don't have time to fight all those guys.
Yoshi muttered as the original 5 guards made their way like rats through the maze of bridges. Pretty soon the entire maintenance level would be swarming with them, and there'd be no way back to safety.
If we can get close enough to the outside edges, I can probably flutter us down to the next level safely.
The old Thugan just shook his head and smiled.
They're not coming here for us, friend. It's the power switch they're after. They want to shut it all back down before everyone gets away.
He glanced over the railing at the sheer number of guards who were making the climb.
This bridge makes a nice choke point. I reckon one of us can hold them back for just long enough.
Yoshi couldn't believe what he was hearing.
No, that's a dumb plan. It's suicide.
This was the kind of thing that he always had to talk Mario out of. Why did it always have to come down to a self-sacrificial gambit?
We'll blow the bridge instead, okay? That way we can both get to safety. With what? Our wits?
Rolf hissed with a roll of his eyes.
Unless you see any explosives or giant axes laying around, this bridge is staying put.
He locked eyes with Yoshi and put a paw on the dinosaur's shoulder.
Listen, somebody has to stay and guard this button. And you need to go and protect your friends.
He had just a bit more to say.
Keep an eye on Bella, alright? And if you ever see that other version of me in your world, the one with the badge shop and the sun.
His voice broke on the last word, and he had to look away.
You let him know that he's the luckiest guy alive.
With that, he pushed Yoshi away, backed into the control room, and slammed the door.
Now go on, get out of here. Go.
It was the most hectic escape of Yoshi's life, and that was saying quite a lot. He fluttered from beam to beam, evading grasping soldiers and thrown spears, taking out the enemies when he could, if only to buy his friend a few more precious seconds of time. He didn't want to look down below, because he knew just how nightmarish the sight would be if he did. The noises and the unnatural wind were enough to make his stomach turn. Yoshi had hoped that the light would play fair, and would fill up the station from the bottom like water flowing into a basin. It moved like a liquid, so why couldn't it behave like one, too? But the light had its own ideas. It was a white flame, eating its way in through solid brick walls. Pipeline Central was vanishing like a burning photograph, and only the smallest wedge of safety remained. That's where he found Goombella and the toads, frantically ushering survivors into the last few standing pipes.
It doesn't matter where it goes, because anywhere is safer than here.
The Goomba girl was shouting, as Toad helped a voluptuous cloud lady herd a cluster of tiny grey insects into the nearest tube. Goombella met Yoshi's eyes as he landed, and her expression slowly fell into a blank stare.
He's not coming back, is he?
The dinosaur shook his head, so she closed her eyes and let herself have 3 deep breaths. She must have been doing some split-second mental rewiring, because when she opened her eyes, she had grown up.
All right, let's get this finished up,
she yelled to the hesitating stragglers.
You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. Get to the nearest pipe and jump.
Yoshi could feel the wind pulling at his back, threatening to trip him backwards and over the railing. The light was practically on top of them now, pulsing, folding space, and reaching out so enchantingly to devour them all. He struggled the few steps over to where his friends stood, at the entrance to the pipe they had picked earlier. With a shared nod, they prepared to make their leap of faith. And with a shared gasp at the sound of screaming, they turned back. Toadette, the lightest of their little party, had been swept off her feet and into the air. The light had chosen her as its next morsel, and she was crying in blind terror as the wind lifted her over the railing and into the abyss.
Please, don't do this,
she wailed as tears of stardust streamed back into the storm.
I don't want to be harvested. Somebody help me.
In an instant, Yoshi was at the banister, letting his tongue fly out to give the girl one last thing to catch. It wrapped about her wrist and held there, and for an eternal moment, the two of them were suspended like that, connected by a thread at the edge of their reality. Then Yoshi's foot slid out from underneath him, and he realized that he had greatly underestimated the light's strength. Or overestimated his own.
I'm still sore from when that guard grabbed me earlier. I'm not strong enough to reel her in.
He shut his eyes to try and summon an energy that he didn't have, and nearly winced when his tongue was snagged by something else. He glanced aside to find Toad, pressed against the railing with a look of fierce determination in his beady eyes. The little shroom was pulling on the sticky tongue like a rope, because apparently that was a thing now.
Twice in one night is pushing it a bit far. Also, he's just putting himself in danger as well.
That's when he felt the sharp bite of fangs around his ankle, and realized that Goombella had grabbed a hold in the only way she knew how. Well, at least they would all be going down together, right? Toadette's shoes were beginning to flake away, and her pigtails were unraveling into a stream of silvery dust.
It's so warm. It makes me feel safe,
she said softly, and soon Yoshi could feel the cozy tingling within himself as well. The light only wanted him to be a part of it, and now it was inviting him to close his eyes and drift off to sleep. And then there was one last pair of hands pulling on his tongue, so much larger and stronger than any of the others. They had a special taste that snapped the dinosaur awake instantly, and he turned to meet the kind eyes of a hefty blue pianta, a passing friend who had finally caught up at the very end. His hands tasted like pineapple eggnog, and it was the best taste in the whole wide world. With a mighty heave-ho, the pianta yanked Toadette into range and snatched her down out of the sky. Goombella was watching in total confusion, but the two young toads looked like they wanted to hug their new friend and keep him forever. Instead, the chuckster merely bundled them all into his arms, and threw them cleanly into the pipe with a smile as the balcony splintered, fell away, and evaporated behind them. The 4 survivors stayed together as they flew into the warp at last. Gravity turned sideways, second-guessed itself, and then twisted the world apart as they blinked away. They had escaped from the city, from the starlight curtain, and from all the certainty their lives had ever known. End of chapter.